Welcome to the Discover podcast, where we view faith as a discovery journey with Jesus to help you become the person God created you to be. Well, hey, everybody. Welcome back to this episode of the Discover podcast. So glad that you're with us. I am joined today by two very special people. Hilary Milsna, who many of you probably know, see around church, see around at the Connection Center. Bryan and Jake Milsna, who is on staff at our church. And then Paul Renaud, who grew up at our church, who is a missionary that our church supports and who is on staff with Crew. So really glad to have you guys. I know that I just introduced you, but why don't you go ahead and reintroduce yourselves, not necessarily saying your name, but just the work that you guys do with Crew, how long you've been doing it, and maybe just real quick how you got into being on staff with Crew.
Yeah, I've been working on staff for almost 20 years now, and really caught the vision of reaching college students for Christ. And so, I love the work. Really, our goal is to win students to Christ, building them up in their faith, and send them out to do their part to help fulfill the Great Commission. So, work mostly at Marquette here in Milwaukee, but a couple other schools.
Just in college, that's where the Holy Spirit just transformed my life. Students know who Jesus is, grow in their faith, and then send them out into the world after college to have an impact for Jesus. And so that's what I've been doing for the last 18 years.
Yeah. And so for those who are not as familiar with Crew, it's focused on college students, reaching college students. And when we think of the different types of ministry that is out there, we would say that Crew is an evangelistic ministry. Define what that is for people, as for maybe if they've never heard that word, like evangelism or evangelistic. Like sometimes people hear the word evangelical and they've now associated it with a political term, when really it has a different undertone to it. So what would you say is an evangelistic ministry?
Say that we want to help equip our students involved, believers involved, to know how to see people, to move towards people in the power of the Holy Spirit, and to feel confident and comfortable in how to communicate their faith.
Yeah. Anything you add to that, Paul?
No, yeah, she summed it up pretty well. We want to share the gospel with people.
Yeah. And as a church where we're at right now, we're in this Storytellers Initiative, Storytellers series. We've been talking for the last year and a half about what it means to be a community of people who are kingdom storytellers, right? We anchor this in Psalm 107, verse 2, that says, "Let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story." Everybody has a story to tell. Everybody has a story of what God has done in their life. And so we want to be people who have the ability to tell their story. And I know that you guys, in working with college students and reaching college students with the gospel, a big tool that you train up students in is to share their story and to tell their story. Oftentimes in Christian circles, we call that your testimony. Mm-hmm. So here's what I'm putting you guys on the spot with this. We can let either one of you go first. Let's pretend you're on a college campus. And maybe if you could think of yourselves in the frame of a college student, or maybe as a Crew worker, how would you go about telling your testimony to a college student?
So how would I share my story?
Yeah.
We're talking how to share my story.
Yeah. What would you do?
This is my story that I would share.
Great.
So most of my life, I would say growing up, could be defined as working really hard to try to prove myself to people, to try to gain people's acceptance and approval. And when I was in middle school, my mom passed away unexpectedly. It just led me to this deeper place of longing. They just sought after me.
They pursued you.
Yeah, they pursued me and asked intentional questions. And as I was in these spaces, I continued to hear the same message, the same story. And that was such a message of freedom for someone who had just been so desperately seeking people's approval. And so early on in my college experience, I started to follow Jesus. I trusted Jesus. And while I would say, I wish I could say I don't care about people's opinions of me, but I absolutely do.
That's great. So I was a part of the reason why I wanted to ask that at the front end. I also wanted to time it. I wanted to see how long that was. And so you did that in probably less than 3 minutes.
That's the goal, actually.
Yeah.
That's the goal.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. Let's kind of if we can take apart what you just did. Because what we're trying to do with this series of episodes is give people a sense of here's how you can do this. Here's how you can actually share your story. And when we think of story, we talk about it in two ways. We talk about it in terms of what God has done in your life in terms of coming to faith, which is kind of what you just shared.
Yeah.
But then we also talk about it in terms of things that God is doing in real time in our life now that we've been following Jesus for however long. And so what we're really talking about today is that come to faith moment where I kind of realized, oh, this is who Jesus is. This is what he has done for me. And this is what he's calling me into, which was your quick summation of your story, which at that point in time would have been 20 some years of your life, but you were able to condense it to 3 minutes. And I'm imagining you could do the same, Paul, right? You probably have, you guys have this paradigm of like, here's how you construct a story around your faith. So let's kind of dissect what Hilary did. And I'm going to ask you this question.
Yeah.
What would you say is in terms of like what she did in that moment that you kind of picked up on as like, here's an important aspect of being able to share your story of faith as you heard her tell hers?
Yeah, as far as structure wise, when we're trying to coach students on how to write out your testimony, it's a lot of what was your life like before Christ, before you came to Christ, or gave him complete control? What has the Lord done in your life since then, or how do you see him working in your life since then? And obviously, people's stories are different. They don't always kind of flow naturally in all of those ways.
Yeah. So sometimes when we think of like this idea of somebody's testimony, their personal story, and if anybody's wondering what is the definition of a testimony or what is a testimony, it's just a personal story, a personal story of what Jesus has done in your life. If we're talking about testimony within the context of like religious faith or following Jesus. And sometimes people think like really amazing testimonies are the really dramatic testimonies. Like, you know, kind of strung out on drugs. I had hit rock bottom and then I saw the light. But for you, like growing up in the church, right? This was the church you grew up in. I don't know if you had a rebellious streak or not, but maybe, you know, I don't think so. So when you think of people who are like coming like, I've been in the church my whole life. Like, how do I don't have this dramatic. How would you answer like for people to think about their story if that's the case?
Like I grew up in the church. I came to Christ at a very young age and kind of progressively grew through youth groups. But I remember wrestling with like, even if externally my life looks, recognizing like a boring testimony is probably something that I pray for my kids. And then that was a big thing when I became a father.
Anything you would add to that? Like how you would coach a student? They're like, hey, my story is boring. I've just grown up in the church my whole life. And
I mean, I think if you grew up with Christian parents who taught you about Jesus, you were in the church environment. So I just think that is something to rejoice in, something to celebrate. You know, like that is, I think all of our stories are so beautiful.
So even still, your point, Paul, was though that what we're trying to do and tell a story about our testimony about what God has done in our life, there has to be some moment of change.
Yeah.
And so maybe it's not this big dramatic change, but there's got to be some change in your life. And maybe it's around worry and anxiety. Maybe it's depression. Maybe it's fear. Maybe it's people pleasing. Maybe even if you haven't had this big streak of rebellion in your life that you didn't have before, that you've grown in over time, that you've begun to see that, oh, like this is what God is doing. He's helping me see the world in this way. So just to highlight again, if you're sharing your story, what you're really looking to share is some sort of change that has taken place. What would be another one? So I'll let you answer this one. You said you noticed that she talked about a moment of change. What else would you say you did in thinking through how to tell your story and how you would coach students in telling their story?
We share stories. This is a time to focus on Jesus and who Jesus is, not to focus on other issues. Even I would say I coach people to avoid denominations, talking about denominations, because I might be sharing my story and share I grew up in some denomination, but I didn't understand who Jesus was. And that could be enough for them to think, like, I'm speaking negatively about a denomination they're a part of. And so whether it's someone feels unseen or...
Meaning somebody's just talking at them.
Yes,
They don't feel seen.
absolutely. Absolutely. And so we are sharing our stories.
Yeah.
We want them to want to know more. We want them to ask questions. Like that's really the goal, because this is about Jesus, not about us. And if we just keep talking and talking, no one's going to want to ask more questions about who Jesus is.
So look, when we're preparing a testimony or when we're working on how do I tell my story, we look for a moment of change. We want to keep it short. We want to build bridges. We want to find ways to connect with people. Anything else that you would add to this that you guys teach students to be mindful of as they're working on their story?
I think part of it too, like with timing, I think there's can be a temptation to become kind of preachy as it goes on too, of like you transition from this is what has happened to me to this is what you should do or how you should change. And that's not really the purpose of your sharing.
Right. God loves you, and I have a wonderful plan for your life.
Also, I would say like don't use Christianese language. A lot of times people share their even just the word testimony. Like
Right.
That's
if
very
somebody's-
Christian-y.
Yeah, if somebody's not a believer, like it's just going to go over the head of something that doesn't.
So those are, I think, 4 or 5 things that are really good. Look for a moment of change. Don't be preachy. Be short. Build bridges. Look to connect with people. Okay, so like you've got like those principles in place of here's things to be mindful of. What would be like that's the framework, but then like what do I do? Do I really sit down and try and write this? If I've never done this before, do I write it out? Do I try and do that? Would you encourage a student to do that?
I would, yeah. I feel like it's helpful to be able to think through ahead of time what you want to share and what you don't want to share.
Yeah.
I mean, especially when you keep it concise. If you want to keep it concise, if you don't plan or you don't prepare, you're just going to keep talking.
Right.
And end up talking in circles. Well, wait, I already talked about that. Or you talk about things that don't really matter.
Yeah.
When I was in high school, this happened, this happened. Okay, that's not essential to what you want to share. Yeah, think through what you want to say, what you don't want to say.
Yeah.
It's a big part of it.
So part of the reason why I wanted to put you guys which was you on the spot to share your story was again to hopefully illustrate the brevity of it, the tightness of it. You had thought it through. You knew the points. You were able to identify. Here's the moment of change. Here's what's happened in my life, and to show that was something that you didn't just pull off the top of your head. Like it might have looked that way because I put you on the spot, but you had actually spent lots of time. I mean, you've been doing this 20 years plus. So and you've led students to do this, but it takes intentionality to really know and think through your story in order to be able to articulate it to somebody. So is there anything else that you would say about like putting together your story? And then we're going to talk about actually sharing
I
it.
think something that can help because it can be hard to condense your life into 3 minutes. Thinking through, just like when you write a paper, you think through like an intro, a theme, body, conclusion, like that can be a good framework to think through. So for my theme is, searching for acceptance and approval. So I think that can be good to narrow it down when you think about putting it all together.
Yeah, I think there's a balance too of vulnerability. Sometimes there can be a draw, especially with kind of thinking about the boring testimony versus maybe the more exciting testimony. Students we work with sometimes they can overemphasize like past sins to try to make it sound more exciting and dramatic. I think we want to be honest about, it depends on the context too, of who you're talking to.
Yeah.
But you want to be honest though.
So just to recap, now we're going to move on to this idea of sharing our story. So if we're writing our story, if we're thinking about how to condense our story, we want to look for a moment of change. We want to be brief with it. We want to not be preachy. We want to be able to build bridges and find ways to connect with people. And then I like what you said about a theme, like those 5 things. If I can think about a theme in my life. So I was a part of crew when I was a student and learned how to share my story as well. And being able to have a theme really helps guide some of the narrative trajectory of your story. All right. So let's say somebody's, they've done the exercise, they've written it out, it's short, it's brief. Now, how are they supposed to think about going and sharing their testimony? Literally when I was in crew, like we would be in contexts where we would literally walk up to strangers to try and make connections.
They'll do that.
And hope for being able to share our story. That sounds terrifying to most people. And actually, I don't do that. Hey, can I talk to you about my faith? Hey, I don't know you. Do you want to hear my story? So how would you coach people around like how do they find ways and context to share their story?
Not that.
Yeah.
My favorite go-to question is asking people about kind of their spiritual background and upbringing and listening and not necessarily forcing that I'm going to share, just being a place where they can share. I tell you a little bit about my story, but this is actually something that I was processing with Jake last week is how there was this season of my life where I was really quick to share my story with people, and I had lots of opportunities in doing that. And it was that season when my kids were little and I spent lots of time at parks and then we'd go to the play area And in both those spaces, I was so intentional. I was so aware of people. I said to Jake, I'm like, I don't feel like I do that anymore outside of my job. And I said, I'm like, well, maybe it's because I'm not in those spaces anymore. And Jake does is like, well, I don't think that's it, because you are. I think sometimes you like pull out your book when you're in those spaces and you don't choose to enter into conversations. And so I think awareness is the biggest piece when it comes to actually having these conversations.
So finding some sort of connection or bridge to spiritual conversation, I think, is really helpful. And sometimes it's depending on how closely you know somebody. Sometimes it's just asking permission. Let's say something like, sometime I'd love to hear more about what your church background is like. It gives them also gives me the opportunity or the permission to figure it out later.
Yeah, I've said a couple of times on this podcast of like asking people like to coffee, like, hey, I'd just love to know your story. Like, I would just love that. Like, I bump into people at the gym on a regular basis, and I see them and I know them, but I don't know them. Like, I don't know a whole lot about them. Just say, hey, would you be interested to have a coffee? I just love to hear your story. Love to know more about you. And then sometimes that opens the door to ask questions around like, hey, do you have a spiritual journey? And I think what you said earlier, looking for like the starting point should be listening to their story before you just push your story on them. Because once you've listened to somebody's story, they're more apt to kind of turn that back around on you and say, oh, well, tell me about your story, whether that's around a specific topic you guys have been talking about.
And I think the more we are naturally sharing about the spiritual aspect, it's not going to feel as weird.
Yeah, it's funny. Like, so, and what we were doing some exercise the other day, and something happened, and one lady was like, "Hey, you could add that to one of your sermons that you got coming up." Like, she's already like now giving me sermon advice, and it just because it's I'm not like telling people I'm a pastor, I'm not, but it's coming up, and. As it becomes a normal part of a conversation, like this is just what I do, or this is the place where I go, or this is a group that I'm a part of. People who are genuinely curious and care about you will ask about that. What any other ways that you would coach somebody on how to share their story? Not just like, hey, I've got to put it together, but when it comes to looking for opportunities, or when it comes to actually sitting down with somebody and sharing it. Any other thoughts?
I think being prepared and kind of having it down. So knowing how to communicate it in a way that makes sense and is still powerful.
That's great.
In a smaller, in a variety of different contexts.
So if we put Hilary on the spot earlier, she gave what would be the 3-minute version of her testimony.
Oh boy!
You need to now give us the 30-second.
30 seconds. Oh,
there you go.
Yeah, I grew up in the church. I would say I became a follower of Christ. Didn't fully understand what that meant until later on, middle school, high school, was when I would say I rededicated my life to Christ, where I really kind of made that choice of like, I'm giving him full control.
Great. So that might have been 45 seconds. Yeah. Might have been 45 segments, but still it was good. And it's funny, you hit those points of like change, right? Like looking for control versus letting go of control. It was obviously brief. And I think anybody who has fear in their life, whether it's a fear of hell or fear of something else, could also resonate with that idea. So here's an interesting question. Let's say you're in a conversation with somebody, you know them somewhat well, you have regular experiences with them, whether it's another parent on a team of one of your kids, or you see somebody at the workplace, or you see somebody at the gym, or a neighbor. Should you ever need to tell your story when it doesn't feel like it's a natural fit in a conversation? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like at what point are we looking for like, this is just a natural segue versus like, I'm just going to do it and we'll see what happens. You know what I mean? Because I think people might feel this pressure, like how do I find these moments? That really intimidates me. Or there are other ways that I can think about sharing my story, or do I just gotta like at some point try and go for it, maybe push it? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think for me it comes down to just being sensitive to the Spirit in those moments of like you're always going to be a battle. There's always going to be a battle with fear. They just the wrong way, and so there's part of it like. I think God calls us to have faith and push through that fear and trust Him. But there's also a sensitivity like, is this an appropriate time for this? And knowing the context of, okay, are there kids around right now or not? So I think there's a balance there. I think being sensitive to the Spirit, like, Spirit, just give me open up my eyes to see those opportunities and take the opportunity.
And this is actually my like best apologetic to why I think sharing testimony matters, as well as like the closest experience I have to that. A few years back, I was on a missions trip, and I was with some students who were on a boardwalk, and we were having this really good conversation about the gospel with these other women. And we noticed that kind of to the side over here on a park bench were these 3 high school guys. And we ignored them, but they got to be really obnoxious. And so at one point I decided to leave that conversation and go talk to these guys. Not because I wanted to. 0% of me, whatever I asked them, what's your name? Are you having a good vacation? Where are you from? They would just look at each other and laugh and roll their eyes. And at one point I didn't know what to do, but I didn't sense that I was supposed to leave yet. And so I just said, I'm down here with a group of college students, and we're having conversations with people about life and spiritual things. And so if you're interested, I would love to hear your spiritual background if you want to share. If somebody laughs at you and asks them their name, there's a pretty good shot that they're going to laugh at you and ask them their spiritual background. And they did. So as I'm sharing my story with them, I can see their posture and their demeanor towards me just being transformed. I can tell that they're listening, they're engaging, faces are becoming ones of interest and compassion. And as I'm talking and observing this in my head, I'm thinking, what in the world is happening right now? Right? And after I was done sharing, one of the guys thanked me for sharing my story, starts opening up about his story and his spiritual background. And then the third guy said, yeah, I can relate as well. And he starts opening up. And then the 4 of us are just having this really sweet conversation. And when that died down, I said, could I have your guys' permission to share with you how someone may have a relationship with God? And they said yes. And I was able to talk about the gospel with them. And I just often think, like, how did that happen? I want to know the cheap things. Or because I necessarily knew what to do. Like, I felt like I was sitting.
Yeah, but that's great. I mean, I think that illustrates some of the things we've been talking about around if you're prepared and knowing what your story is, and there's a door that's open, but it's like you said, stories have power. Stories can like change the temperature of a situation, can open people up, can drop down walls, and can really help open doors for people to start thinking about things differently. So I think that, again, illustrates the power of a story in their lives. So this has been a great conversation. Really appreciate you guys taking the time to help us think through how do we get intentional about knowing our story for the sake of sharing it and looking for opportunities to engage with people in hopes that the Lord might open. So I hope you found today helpful. I hope you join us next time, next week. Jake will be back with me, and we're going to be talking about these Kairos moments that we've been talking about for the last year. Like, God has done something in my life in the past, and that's an important story to share. What about those things that he's doing in real time? Like, how do I think about sharing those moments as well? So hopefully you'll join us for that episode next week. Have a great rest of the week.